Okay, it's a Friday afternoon, and I thought that what Mariana and I would do would be to tell you a story. And it's a story about Richard, and it's a story about information, and I think you could argue it's a story about how the police saw themselves as knowledge brokers for Richard's works. But it is a story, and it's a story that Richard and I participated in, and a whole bunch of other people here in the room participated in various parts, and that occurred between about 1979 and 82 or 3. And I think Richard and I always spoke about writing something about it, but we never did. And partly we didn't because we didn't know what it was other than what we thought anyway was a good story. And so when the topic of the symposium came up, Mariana and I talked about what to do. And although I participated in this story, and it was before she joined the Center of Criminology, as it was then called, that we decided to work together on it, in part because it might have helped me, or we both hoped it would help me figure out what was important or what was interesting, or at least what was funny about this story. So it has to do with these two books, Richard's first two major contributions in the area of policing. I mentioned on the slide that the first one, Making Crime, was republished by the University of Toronto Press, which, as you'll see as the story unfolds, there's a little bit of irony in that. In certain ways, it's a simple story. It's a story about the books and the police response to these books, the university's response to the police, the university's response to Richard, to me, to everything. But it's the relationship also of research to what's going on, and in a sense, there's some object lessons about research. At another level, it's a more complex story. It's about what happens when the police don't get their way, how the police try to control information. It's about the relationship of the university to researchers. And then, again, as a kind of funny aside, it's a story about the police relationship to the university and how they really don't understand what universities are. But it's also a story about how each of these institutions, the police and the university, gets differentiated into different parts and sort of comes together and moves apart in different ways. Richard, when he wrote about the police decades later, in 2007, there's a quote from the paper in Punishment Society that says, the police don't let a challenge to police authority pass without response. That's the understatement of this story, because the police, as you'll see, saw Richard's work as a direct challenge to what they were doing. So that, I think, is related in a very direct way to a headline that appeared in the Toronto Star on July 4th, 1981, which I'll quote, and it said, "Why do the police hate this man?" So the police major concern, as you'll see, was their authority. I think it was also their image. But it was also, the story as it unfolds, I'm telling you about the story rather than the story, is a story about how, is a story about research roles and the police understanding of it. Now, Richard, as you know, if you know those two books, the first of these two books that's listed is a study, as it says, of detective work. The second is a police patrol work. This was research that was done. I haven't talked about the name of the regional police force outside of Toronto ever, because that was part of our original agreement. I actually find it very difficult to name it, so I won't. It's a regional police force named after a very famous person related to police, the history of policing. And one of my colleagues said, "Can we refer to this as this region as the Robert Regional Police Force?" And our lawyer, Ed Greenspan, who's a very well-known criminal lawyer in Canada, I was at a meeting and I passed a note to him and I said, "Eddie, can we call it Robert. And he crossed out Robert and he sent it back. He said, no, you can't call it Robert, you have to call it Banana. Anyway, without going into details about the book, many of you know of this book, certainly. There were two things in the book that the police found particularly objectionable. And I've quoted, fortunately from the book, these two passages. And the passages obviously dealt with what the police saw as illegal behavior. The police didn't like anything else about the book. But they particularly didn't like the idea that police detectives would sign the names of justices of the peace on search warrants when it was convenient for them to do so. The irony of this is that Richard used those as examples really to show that the testing of the validity of a search warrant by a justice of the peace didn't mean anything anyway, because the justice of the peace would just sign them. They didn't read them. They didn't talk about them. And you could see that to some extent when a new justice of the peace would ask a question, what are your reasonable and probable cause? You know, the police would say, what do you care? And that the justice of the peace would say, well, I just wondered, and then he'd sign it, and that would be the end of it. So the point was, Richard, in saying this, was it didn't really matter whether it was justice of the peace signature on it, and it was sort of an aside, you know, buried in the middle of the book. Anyway, Richard in 1979 wrote what was originally one book, he in this one book he had actually combined the two books, and then subsequently decided that he really had to split it into two. Now the chief, there's a quote from him there, but the chief, I think it's important to understand, was a chief of this new region. He was university educated and very proud of the fact that he had a bachelor's degree. One of the campuses of the University of Toronto is in that region, which again is relevant. And we'd had an agreement that was written in 1976 about what the deal was in terms of access and publishing and so on. And obviously it said that the police couldn't censor it, but it was a not very well written document. On our side, I think because we really just wanted access, and we were concerned that the police would try to get sort of control over the manuscript. But one of the things that it said was that the police had the right to answer if they wish, and have included in any report any criticism of police procedures and or conduct of individual police officers. Nobody actually figured out what that meant. And my worry all the way through this, especially at one point later on, was that the police would see this as a way of, in effect, getting a veto, because we couldn't guarantee to any publisher, if the police wanted to present 150 pages of criticism, that any publisher would actually would publish that, and it would effectively stop publication. But nevertheless, we signed the thing. That was 1976. Things went on. The research was done. There were a few problems of access to certain things, as one always expects to find. And Richard wrote a draft of the book in 1978, 79, and gave, as we'd agreed to, this copy of the one huge book to the police. And as you can see on that, the police response was they didn't like it. They said they didn't like it in a little bit fancier language, but they didn't like it. And they said, we intend to carry out a comprehensive review of the study. And Richard said, that's fine. You know, we'd love to have your comments because I'm writing about them. Okay. In the spring of 1980, so a year later, Richard delivered to them a draft, which in effect was the second draft of first the mobile police manuscript. And the police response, this is now a year later, The police said, "We're disturbed by the fact that the draft was produced without your having the benefit of the force's substantial critique of it." And the chief said, "I feel that this second draft is neither representative of police activities nor our tremendous responsibilities. For this reason, I feel that a balance must be struck." I don't know whether we took that seriously, but if you read between the lines on that, you realize that what the police are telling us is that they actually saw themselves as a kind of a co-author of this book. Well, subsequently, Richard did get comments. And he got the first set of comments on the patrol manuscript were 45 pages single-spaced and divided into different sections. And the sections are listed there for you. And you can see that they did take it seriously. The detective manuscript had 33 single-spaced, legal-length pages of commentary. They took it seriously, and in fact, one of the stories about this, of course, is that they had the resources to do that. Now, the commentary was essentially a few things they said, look, you don't understand the law here. Those were useful. There were other things that were sort of technical things that they wanted clarified. Most of it, though, were wordings that they didn't like. And one of my favorites when I was going through this in anticipation of this talk was this one, which I won't read to you, but if you skim it, what you see is that the police are saying that they didn't like what, I love the first line, but anyway, that the police didn't like what Austin Turk had said. And so they kind of thought Richard should change Austin Turk's words or meaning that he was quoting, and they say if that's not done, the inference is that the police themselves are the authority, which cannot be, further explanation would be useful, and so on. I mean, there were a number of things like this, where essentially what they're telling us is not what is wrong or what is misunderstood or something of that sort, but how they wanted things to be constructed. So this was early August 1980. A few days before those were delivered, Richard and my role in this was that I was then director of the Center of Criminology. Richard and I were summoned to the chief's office on the 31st of July, 1980. And we met there with the chief, the deputy whom we certainly knew quite well, the chief's executive assistant, who, to make things more complicated, was one of our master's students, a career police officer. And Richard and I, when we drove out to this meeting, knew that this was not going to be a friendly meeting, obviously. And we also knew, though, that this was not the time to say anything. So we were basically there to listen. And what we were told was that the report was negative, it was anti-police, they had various concerns, but those concerns were really concerns about, and they used the term rotten apples. They said that Richard hadn't studied the special squads that the force had. Of course, the reason he hadn't studied the special squads is they didn't let him study the special squads. But because of that, it was a biased story, that there were unwritten agreements about what was to be covered in the book that were not upheld. And that was a confusing statement. Richard and I mostly sat there taking notes. And the reference to unwritten agreements, we didn't understand at the time, and we didn't actually understand it for a number of months later. And in Richard's notes, Richard and I made notes about most of these meetings. And in Richard's own notes, Richard said, their interests are as usual at the heart of the matter. It is proving to be interesting, especially as this meeting serves to reconfirm all my data on the police retrospective accounting practices and related matters. But the difficulty, and this is something, again, that we learned over time, is that the police have infinite resources and we didn't. Now, this is not an unusual problem in dealing with the police, but we found very quickly I mean, just like the notes in the previous slides, I mean, the idea that you're going to sit down and write 75 pages of commentary on somebody's book, I mean, none of us have ever done that. As it turned out, there was one of these unwritten agreements. I was told, quite naively by the chief of police on the phone, that this was, agreed to with the previous director at lunch on a particular day, and the chief told me what the agreement was, but he told me it was clear from listening to it on the phone by reading a transcript. And I'm thinking, this was at lunch at the faculty club at the University of Toronto, and he has a transcript of this. I'm in trouble. And I said, well, I don't know anything about previous agreements, and I don't know anything about unwritten agreements. And then shortly thereafter, the police chief the previous director was on holiday in Nova Scotia. The police chief went to Nova Scotia on the taxpayer's dime to speak to him. I, of course, didn't find out about this until later. Richard did this work with mainly one other researcher who by then was a probation officer in northern Alberta. The police flew out to interview him unannounced. They involved very senior police in this investigation. They involved the Attorney General for Ontario. And then we had some sort of informal relationships with the Canadian Police College, which is responsible supposedly for the training of senior police officers. They brought in the Canadian Police College to deal with this. On little things, this is pre-fax, pre-email, almost pre-courier. The delivery of documents for us was a super pain. I mean, just getting things from our office down to our lawyer who was downtown was a problem. They, of course, always had police officers delivering things. They would just bring things. They'd have a young police officer drive down to deliver documents to us. They had one of the big, still big Canadian firms acting for them. But on little things, aside from the 75 pages of commentary, they did a chronology at some point to sort of keep things in line, who said what when and what the documents were. This document was 63 single-spaced pages. We got it from the university lawyer because they gave it to the university lawyer for various reasons. But again, for us to do that, for us to do these kind of simple, mundane things would have been a huge undertaking. They also got the Ontario Provincial Police to do an investigation, and their investigation that took place in November '81 took a couple of months, according to the police officer who did it, working full time. What Richard and I had on this was Richard and I decided that, and the reason I'm able to talk about this, is that it was important for us to have documentation. We needed to know what was going on, and every meeting that we had, one of us, when we would leave the meeting, we'd say, okay, who's going to write the notes up this time? And we would write up notes, and we kept all the documents, and we kept all our notes. And so fortunately, we had all that. We did this because we were negotiating, and there was always what people said on what days. We were concerned about legal dealings, which was always a threat, and we had no idea what was going on in the future. So the first real threat, the first time I think we felt things were really serious, was about noon on August 13th, 1980, when the deputy chief of police and the head of detectives visited the Center of Criminology. They did give us notice, but they did visit. They told us they were coming, and they wanted us to be there, and Richard and I were there. And they came into my office to meet Richard and me. And they essentially had a series of questions to ask us. And it was, in a sense, a form of interrogation. They pretty much knew that we weren't going to answer. The main thing that they were starting with was who did the various, as they described them, illegal activities. So, for example, forging the names of the justices of the peace on the search warrants. And they went through remember, they read this book carefully. They went through these things and said, who saw this and who was the police officer involved? And Richard would say, one of the researchers saw it, and we're not telling you who the police officer was, and we're not telling you which researcher. So they asked each of these things, and then they told us that, from our notes, they said, there are obstruction sections in the criminal code. We're going to find out what happened. We intend to lay charges. If we don't get cooperation, we're going to use all our investigative skills. And then when Richard told them that many of the records at that point had been destroyed, they said to us that, because they were original field notes, they said there are issues if people destroy records. So they left. And Richard and I looked at each other and said, well, what do we do now? And our first thing was, we better tell our own bosses about this, who didn't know anything about it. So I called the dean, our dean, of the dean of the School of Graduate Studies, and I said, we have a little trouble. And I explained what it is, and he said, I think you better go see the vice provost or the provost's office. And we got kind of assigned to the vice provost to deal with this. And we wrote out a kind of history of what was going on. And right off the bat, I think Richard and I both knew that given that the way in which things had gone and the little exchange we'd had in my office with the police, we had to be careful about what we said where. But our first concern, as Margaret Jackson, sitting here smiling, will remember, is we may have gotten rid of some of our notes, but we had, like most researchers, a huge amount of information, field notes and things. And the field notes, it was a well-funded study, so the original field notes had been handwritten, and then they were transcribed, they were typed out, and we had both of these things. And I, as director, said to everybody at the center, by midnight or by any time you go home, this place has to be clean, because we have no idea what's going on. And they've essentially said they may be coming in. We had no idea what their authority might be, if they had any authority, but we decided this was serious. Well, I didn't know anything in 1980 about shredding. And I said, who knows what a shredder looks like or where there's a shredder? We didn't have a shredder. I didn't know whether the university had shredder. And Margaret said, oh, I know where there's a shredder. And it, pardon? You're implicating. And so Margaret and I put boxes of stuff into my car, and we drove down to the major mental hospital in Toronto, where there was a shredder. And we just walked into this place and walked to the shredding room and shredded an enormous amount of stuff that we should have shredded before. It was the original of the field notes that had been transcribed. And then other data that Richard was understandably reluctant to get rid of, we moved. And we moved, it was like a bad movie. We moved, we would give it to somebody who would give it to somebody who would give it to somebody who would give it to my ex-wife. And she gave it to her grandmother. And then others of it appeared months later as baby clothes in people's closets and things. We just decided that the center had to be clean before anybody went home. And the vice provost, interestingly enough, who Richard and I had gone to talk to, said, okay, this is serious, and we have to have a thing. If the police do come, if anything happens, there has to be a whole set of contingencies as to who to call, and included various university people. But by then, things had gotten complicated, obviously. Things had gotten complicated partly because we had lots of different parties. And one person who we talked to that Wednesday afternoon said to us, kind of casually, you better get your own lawyer. And I said, yeah, but the university provost's office will, involve the university lawyer. And they said, no, you better get your own lawyer. And of course, it was the best advice we'd ever had on this, which is, if you don't have your own lawyer, you don't have privilege. And it's almost that simple. You don't have anybody to talk to. We had support from our dean all the way through. So we called Eddie Greenspan, who I mentioned earlier, is a major criminal lawyer And it dealt with this particular police force in a very celebrated case a few years before. But the problem was that, that the police, in a sense, knew how to deal with people like us, and they knew how to deal, and we'd had very little experience in dealing with them. Richard had studied them, so nothing they did surprised him. But for example, they just simply showed up unannounced. And they did another thing of asking Richard a series of questions that he wasn't going to answer. And they did that very shortly after the first meeting. When the university got involved, the university at first said, well, let's all meet, a really university thing. Let's all meet and let's sort of call a meeting and get the police there and various things. And for ways that I haven't yet been able to reconstruct, but in my own notes, I indicate that I was very uneasy about it. At this very first meeting involving the vice provost, the dean, somebody from the Canadian Police College, the police chief, various other police, the whole set of characters, Richard was excluded. And I guess, and I'm only guessing, I mean, in my notes I said I was very uneasy about it, but felt we didn't have much choice, and Eddie Greenspan, our lawyer, said that we didn't have any choice, I should go. I felt very uneasy about this. I don't know why they excluded Richard. I think they were trying to make a deal, and it's sort of like the lawyers making a deal without the client being there. Now, I warned the university lawyers beforehand. I said, this isn't going to be the way you think it is. These guys are crazy, and they don't understand. But what happened is the police went in and figured, well, they're going to talk to my boss, Richard's boss, and we'll get Richard's boss, the vice provost, 2 or 3 or 4 levels above Richard, to tell Richard he can't publish it the way it is and to get him to change it. Their view was, all you have to do is convince the vice provost or the president or somebody, and then the book will change and that'll be the end of it. And they were quite shocked by the fact that didn't seem to work, and the vice provost understood that he didn't really have the authority to tell Richard what he should be writing. But at that same meeting, the police were naive enough so that they mentioned some of these informal discussions with the previous director, and they read from the transcript, kind of in front of us all. And again, everybody sort of understood what was happening. I should mention, sorry, in that one, that the lawyers weren't involved at that point. The university had notified their lawyer, but the lawyer said he didn't want to be there for that. The lawyers got involved a couple of months later when the police lawyers, this big Toronto law firm, sent Richard a letter suggesting that these events never took place, that Richard had somehow hallucinated them or that they'd been jokes or something. And then in any case, we weren't following the publication agreement, and therefore we should back off, take out these things, and slow down the publication. There's some interesting stories about them delivering this letter, but they delivered it and it was copies to everybody who you could imagine. Our lawyer, Eddie Greenspan, wrote a letter back saying, first of all, you violated your own rules because you know perfectly well that I represent these people in the Center of Criminology. So why are you writing to clients rather than writing to me as lawyer? The university, of course, got upset with that because the university said you can't. The university wrote back a letter saying that the Center of Criminology is an unincorporated unit within the University of Toronto. By implication, we can't, as an institution, retain a lawyer. We can as individuals, but not as an institution, which I had said that we were going to be doing. In any case, the university's response initially was, well, let's look for a solution to this. And at one point in a subsequent meeting that Richard was at, the vice provost said, maybe I should take a look at this manuscript, and maybe I should send it out for reviews and sort of see what we're talking about. And I actually didn't know what to say at that, and I just said, what are you going to do when you get back these reviews? And what happens if somebody says something negative about this book? Absolutely inevitable, right? You send it out to people, you're going to get some sort of criticism. What are you going to do? And I think at that point, the vice provost began to understand that he was in a tough position in the sense that, or maybe an easier position, that what he can't do is actually sort of take responsibility for this book in the same way. But they were obviously very nervous, and they became nervous when they started looking at the contract, because the contract never talked about the timing of the relationship of the police giving us their comments, or how long they would have to write a commentary, and how we could guarantee the commentary. Meanwhile, we told the publisher of this first book, Butterworth's, about it, and Butterworth, the very first time, said, "Oh yeah, well great, there's no problem at all, that's what police are like, and what do you expect?" And then as soon as the police started being nasty, Butterworth said, "Well, we want you to indemnify us if there are any costs involved in our defending the book." So by this time, the list of parties had exploded. So there's Richard and me, there's the dean on the one hand. Our dean alternatively thought this was funny, or didn't, thought it was just somehow, it was such a bizarre thing, he couldn't understand it. We have the police. The police at one point split from the police board and sort of tried to differentiate themselves from their own board, although there's no disagreement. They were using the fact that there is a police department and a police board. You have the Canadian Police College involved. The funding agencies, the police wrote to all of the funding agencies and said Richard was being irresponsible. And in late December of that same year, the Solicitor General and Attorney General for Ontario got involved. I had been told by various lawyers I should tell the Attorney General, whom I happen to know. And I think they would have found out anyway, because it seemed as if they already did know. The previous director, as I said, had been involved and had done various things. It wasn't a dispute between Richard and me on the one hand and the police on the other. It was much more complicated than that. Well, I am running out of time. I'm spending more time than I wanted, but the police extended their investigation of this. They sort of started talking about a variety of different things, and at one point they had a new construction about what it was that Richard had done. At first it was that Richard had that these things had never happened, or that if they happened they were just isolated incidents. And then at later point they said that Richard was libeling the police force, which was an interesting legal question. And then later on it became that Richard had committed the offense of reporting an offense that didn't take place. So it was sort of a moving target throughout this whole process. The turning point in a certain way was a meeting, again, which Richard, in this case I as well, was not allowed to go to. It was a meeting called by the police board involving the police board, various other people on the police board, and there was sparring back and forth between our lawyer and the university's lawyer as to whether they should go at all, because there was no agenda and no particular purpose. As it turned out, our lawyer, Eddie Greenspan, said that he felt he had to go because he was looking down the road as to what it would look like if he didn't go. He said, "So I'm going to go. I don't care if the university lawyer goes." The university lawyer, when Eddie went, felt he had to go in order to keep Eddie Greenspan in check. So there were two lawyers, one representing the university, one representing Richard and me there. And there was an articling student whose job it was to take notes. So we got elaborate notes on that, including the muttering of the university's lawyer, who said, "I don't believe it. I don't believe this is happening," all the way through. And he couldn't believe that the police were acting the way they were. And that actually was terribly important, because shortly after that meeting, the university's lawyer wrote to the police lawyer and said, "I want to know who you represent." And do you represent the board? Do you represent the police chief? Do you represent the police force? Tell me who you represent. And he also said he wanted a confirmation that because there had been sparring about who had received the manuscripts, that the police chief received the manuscripts on behalf of the board, and if he hadn't given them to the board, he, the university's lawyer, said, that's your problem, that's not our problem. And then probably the most aggressive one was that the university lawyer said, we want tapes of all the conversations that have taken place with the researchers. Not, do you have tapes? We want the tapes. We want copies of the tapes. And remarkably, the police lawyer wrote back and said, we'll give you the tapes, but you can't let Doob or Erickson listen to them or read the transcripts of them. And the university's lawyer, you wonder sometimes. The university's lawyer at that point understood what was going on. He absolutely understood. And so things sort of continued. My conversations, by the way, which weren't in person at this time, was that the vice provost would call me up. And he's a very busy man. He'd call me up and he'd say, hi, Tony, it's Bill. Can you go and call me back sometime? And that was code for me to go leave my office, go downstairs, go to a payphone, put in money, and call him. And because he didn't want to talk to me on my own phone, partly because the police had already revealed, in a similar way to what we were talking about earlier, there was absolutely clear evidence that various phones, and mainly Richard's home phone, was being wiretapped. And not because they were ever going to use it as evidence, but because they were going to use it for information. And they did use it for information. So the vice provost says, I'm not going to talk to you on your phone. At least they can make them tap all of those payphones down at the ground floor of Robarts Library before we're going to get it. So the university at this point had understood. They sort of knew where they were going. The problem was they weren't sure. I mean, they still were worried about this. And the thing that was then bothering them was the notion that were breaching a contract because we hadn't waited long enough for the police to respond, that these things didn't really occur. And the issue about an outside reader came up at that point. But then also, I was well briefed by our own lawyer on this thing. The university lawyer at one point turned to me and said, well, there are these two things about search warrants that the police are really upset with. Who is it who saw those? So I can talk to them and find out, myself and assure myself. And I looked at him and I said, I had the presence of mind because I've been told. I said, who do you represent? This is to a big lawyer in one of the big law firms. And he said, well, I represent the governing council of the University of Toronto. I said, so if any member of the governing council says, who saw that thing happen, what would you say? He says, I guess I'd have to answer. I said, oh. He said, I guess I don't want to know. And so, but they were understanding these things. At one point, subsequently, they finally did understand. And this is and I put this on a slide because it's sort of funny at this point. They wrote to the police on the 24th of February. This would be 3 weeks after the meeting with the police. And they said, the university has decided to authorize the Center of Criminology to proceed with the publication plans, as if the university had the right to authorize its Center of Criminology. Its was important, but its Center of Criminology, and rather than Richard, and in any case, who are they authorizing? But that was sort of the way in which things went. Well, the police did take advantage of the opportunity to write a commentary. And Richard described it in his own commentary on the commentary as heavy-going and difficult. There was sparring between me and the police about an anonymous commentary. I said, I don't think we can publish an anonymous commentary. Richard's standing by what he's saying. Why don't you stand by what you're saying? And they said, no, we've decided to ask you something which was always part of the deal, which is not to name the police force, so we can't be anonymous, or we want to be anonymous. But this was what Richard was describing as heavy going. And it went on and on and on. I mean, the irony of it all was, I have a note to myself on page numbers. I read it and I thought it was hilarious. And so, but the only problem was that they had given page numbers, and I'd said the undertaking was we wouldn't change a thing. And so we didn't undertake, we tried to fulfill that undertaking, except they had page numbers written down for the manuscript pages. So I called up and I thought, this is a trap that they're not going to fall for. And I said, can I change these so that they are the actual page numbers? And they said, oh yes, of course. So I confirmed that in writing to them. And then that became the document, which if you want to find anything that the police don't like in that book, you look at the police commentary, and you just look down the thing for page numbers. And absolutely everything that they find really objectionable that Richard wrote has a page reference to it. You might as well put it in the index, or a list of it in the introduction. Well, I won't read that to you, but if you read the first line, you get the tone of it. And, on the allegations, again, they have serious question on the basis of the allegations. And what I found interesting is sort of throughout this thing is that the term for forging justice of the peace signatures on search warrants was always referred to as left-handing. And left-handing of search warrants seemed to be a term that everybody understood. And I always wondered as a non-police researcher, why do you have a word for something that doesn't ever happen? And they just described this they talked about it as left-handing of search warrants. I said, okay, this is interesting that doesn't happen. Anyway, the sequel to this is that this was book one, and it came out in late 1981. Richard and I had been going through this now for a year and a half in serious ways. So the University of Toronto Press was publishing his second book, Reproducing Order. And we went through the University Press. The University Press says, oh, Butterworth, they're so chicken about these things. That's a commercial publisher. We're an academic publisher. And as soon as things started to heat up, they said, oh, well, if Butterworth is getting indemnification, we'll need it too. Which then raised questions about what the role of the press was. And they said that basically they wouldn't proceed with it until the university gave them indemnification. We were concerned about that one as well, because there were a couple of incidents where Richard talked about how, in front of the researchers, the police had taken accused people and beaten them up. And we figured that they would think that maybe that was illegal too, and might be concerned about it. But I think what happened, Eddie Greenspan's explanation was maybe they think it's legal. I think a more plausible explanation is that they'd actually learned. And they had a couple of things that they thought Richard gotten wrong, and one of them that they thought was a sort of security issue having to do with some fringe group that they made Richard change the name of or something. It was completely unimportant. But that book went through, it was published, it had the descriptions of accused people being beaten up, and there were no comments. It was well reviewed and very favorably reviewed. The police didn't say anything about it. Nobody really cared. Well, the problem was that the first book did get into the press. That's where the headline of "Why do the police hate this man?" came out. And there was an investigation by the Attorney General, apparently, and they decided eventually to end it. And we never found out it was ending, or had ended, until September 1982. I was talking with a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio reporter who said, oh, by the way, the Ontario Provincial Police has finished its investigation. There aren't going to be any charges against you. And I said, oh, where did you hear that? He said, oh, I heard it a couple weeks ago. I was asking them about it just as a sort of follow-up. I mean, this whole story, as I said, took a couple of years. I'm not sure what to make of it. I'm not sure what it tells you. It certainly tells you the police dealt with us as suspects, and the changing stories about what was wrong and what we had done and what the criminal charges were sounded very familiar to anybody who read Richard's detective book. The interesting thing for us was the lack of knowledge that the police had of the university institution, and also looking back at it from 30 years ago, from 30 years sort of living with it, the relationship that we had to the university is, now I can talk about it as being an interesting one. It was certainly problematic at the time because we never knew quite where we were. But the dynamic nature of these institutions, both in terms of the positions they were taking, but also in terms of what the institution was. The police force, Richard felt a very strong obligation to the police officers he had observed not to reveal. The police administration had a different set of interests, which obviously had to do with their view of things. We never understood what the board was doing. We never had any really direct responsibility with the board. The lawyers involved were obviously doing their thing. The university, as I said, has acted in a variety of different ways, and in the end, very favorably toward us, though we never had that confidence as things went along. So that's the story. Now, what it means, I'll leave to you.
No, we're running over time here, but I believe we need to devote at least a few minutes to questions.
Well, I hope you guys do write it up. I think it would be a fantastic contribution to the citizens that would be knowledge of this. But I guess one question I have, Tony, is I'm assuming maybe the police thought they would get you to, or get Richard to revise this. But if they did, the question I have is sort of, who was the audience for this performance? In other words, were they doing this for the JPs to let them know that they wouldn't tolerate this kind of stuff in their force? Were they doing it for the junior policemen?
I think the audience, I think they had a view of academic books which was completely wrong. And I think their view was that this book is going to come out and everybody will read it and it'll be on the front page of all the newspapers. And you know, I mean, that was their view. Because I think that I had this discussion with the chief at this very first meeting that Richard and I went out to on the July 31st, 1980. And we went out and I said, look, let's be real about this. You know, if you don't make a fuss about it, we'll have a big press release when it's out and thank you and everything. And, you know, you can write anything you want in the press release and that's all anybody's going to look at. I mean, we all know that that's the case, that that's going to happen. Nobody's going to look at this book. And the only reason anybody does is because because they put the page numbers of all the dirty stuff. So I think that their concern was that they would be on the front page of the newspaper. I think at the same time, I've obviously skimmed over because I can talk about this for hours, but at the same time, I think the chief of police saw this as a way of him differentiating himself. The reason I think we got in there was that the chief of police saw it as a way of differentiating his police force from all the rest, that he let the researchers in and gave kind of open access and allowed this thing to happen. And they were very proud of it. When the program first started in about 1975 or 6, they did have press releases about it. And so I think that they saw this in the beginning as kind of a good thing about how open they were, and then they saw it kind of turning to shit. Yeah.
I went through kind of a similar thing on a lesser scale maybe, and one or two things come to mind. Is first of all, it took me months to find from the university when the press wanted to be identified what insurance coverage we had. Were they going to pay for lawyers? They weren't forthcoming for months on something as simple as that. And what I think of in your case is, who paid your lawyer? And did you get coverage under the university insurance policy for faculty?
We paid him 100% of his fee, which was zero. That's the answer. And he spent, I mean, was then and still is, a very, very busy criminal lawyer. And he did it as a favor. And he did it because he believed in it. And he did it because he thought it was worthwhile. And so the only thing the university said about that was, we won't pay for your lawyer. I mean, they told me that beforehand. And
Your university should have had coverage for faculty. Ours
well,
does.
well,
They don't like to admit it, apparently.
I'm sure Eddie would have liked it too. But, you know, I mean, the answer is that, I mean, we were very lucky. Now, as it turned out, I mean, a whole bunch of other lawyers I know would have been happy to do it. I mean, we chose Greenspan from this group of lawyers who I knew would be willing to do it. We chose Greenspan in part because he dealt with all of these people. He knew the chief of police, the deputy chief of police, the head of detectives. He knew them all because of this case that had gone on that he had tried a few years before. So he knew them very well. And in fact, the chief of police said to me, before this all blew up, I went in and there was something about this case on the deputy chief, I don't know what I said, the deputy chief's desk about this case. And I said, oh, you're reading about your case, because they won the case. And he said, yeah. And I said, there was a thing about the two lawyers involved, and Greenspan was the junior lawyer. And I said, what do you think about the lawyers, just naively? This is way before anything had happened. And he said, well, Greenspan's a really good lawyer. If I ever needed a criminal lawyer, I'd get Greenspan. So I thought, nah, good. Beat you to it.
One more question? Susan?
So I was part of the MA class that started in 1980, and many things become clear. Including my subsequent relations with police when we were doing research. But I was wondering if you can comment on the impact that this might have had on future students coming out of police services.
That's a good question. Certainly, you know, we were told by, I'll expand your question. We were told that you know, this was not going to make it any easier to do research in police departments. I mean, I'll tell you that the other police departments, you know, around the area a number of them had been asked, and none of them had allowed the research to be done. So it wasn't as if this kind of research, we had our choice of places. This was the place that allowed us to do it. In terms of police, we subsequently had police officers coming into our master's student program. We had police officers in our undergraduate program. I had various discussions sort of on the side. I had a discussion with the Toronto chief of police, and I said, he was coming to lecture to my undergraduate class, and I joked with him. I said, pretty good of you to come, given that one of your colleagues out there is giving me trouble. He says, oh, Tony, he said, you don't take that seriously, do you? I said, yeah, I take it. And he's thinking, like, come on, they don't, you know, they're not going to do anything. They can't. I mean, he was much more sophisticated. This is Jack Ackroyd. And he knew that nothing was going on. I mean, that doesn't help me very much. But I think that other police, I mean, from an individual police officer's perspective, the ones that I talked to, who I happen to have done a completely different study from Richard in that same place because Richard had gotten access. And the ones I spoke to during this thing were very, very pleased, but couldn't say anything, that Richard was holding tough. I mean, they all knew that that they weren't going to be named. And they understood that issue. And they saw that their police chief was going after stuff which was really nonsense. I mean, these things were clearly happening all the time. And, you know, nobody, it was just routine things. So I think, I don't think it had a long-term impact. I mean, even with the then Attorney General, he was always cordial with us. I was doing some work for indirectly for him, and he came to a reception when the report I was working on was released, and joked with me about it. I mean, I think that they all sort of different. I mean, joke. You know, it's easy for him to joke, but it was. I think that the other people, officially, the more senior people kind of understood that this was crazy, and I think in terms of our institutional, we talked about this, and quite frankly, none of us had any choice anyway. I mean, there were no choices. I mean, nobody ever suggested that we should approach it in a different way. So in many ways at the time, what are we going to do? The books are going to be published. They're going to be published as Richard wants them, and we're going to resist everything else. And so I didn't think about it very much.
Final question.
The language that is used there is the sort of thing you expect from an 18-year-old who is trying to impress you with their...
That was our MA student.
This is the sort of thing which any adult would say, look, try again.
Yes. I mean, my feeling when I got this thing, it was delivered, I think, to me. And when I got it, I thought, oh, God, I mean, starting that thing off with this, using big words when you don't know how to use them, it was silly. And, had they not done that, there would have been no press about it. I mean, even right to that point, if they hadn't done it. And I told them that, but, they do that, and we look at it, Richard, the first thing I looked at it was, I thought, oh, thank God it's not 100 pages long, because then we're going to have trouble with the publisher. And then after that, I didn't care, and if I were nice, I would have, but they weren't listening to me anyway. They thought I was evil. But, if I were really nice, I would have tried to persuade them. I wasn't that nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually going to intervene at this point. Remind everybody that we do have this room available through